Hey, everybody. Okay, hi. Um, so did everybody figure out what they are? And I hope I got a couple questions just to confirm the exercise. You should be very specific. So if it's an auto company, it should be like Tesla or Volkswagen, and you're stuck with it for the rest of the class. You're not going to switch each time. Did Yes. Um, so did everybody complete it? Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to kick it off with some thoughts, and then I'll hand it over to Jay-Z. Um, so we're talking about, I'm going to talk a little bit about autonomous systems. The IEEE engineering definition is a device or system that accomplishes, partially or fully, a function that was previously conceivably could be carried out, partially or fully, by a human operator. So this is really about sort of automation in the sense of automating a factory, taking away jobs and converting them into machines. Interestingly, this autonomy comes up a lot in the context of autonomous weapons and military. So unmanned aerial vehicles is an area that the military folks like to think a lot about in terms of automation. It's not new. So back in 1849, the Austrians attacked Venice by putting explosives on unmanned balloons to fly them over Venice and try to bomb them. It was only partially successful, but this is the first recorded unmanned aerial vehicle. And so since then, the military has always been working with drones and other things, and they've been, but obviously it's not a new thing, but I guess we wouldn't call this necessarily autonomous, but it is autonomous in the sense that once they were let go, they didn't report back or weren't controlled by human beings. More modern thinking in the military, it's interesting. So they think about it a lot in terms of reducing manpower. So right now, when you have drone operators that control things directly, it's very manpower intense. It takes lots and lots of people to fly a drone, and they're trying to shift to systems that are more and more, in their words, autonomous. And so the next level up is trying to do it so that the thing flies around and makes requests and makes approvals, and that the people can manage multiple drones. And then in the future, and where they're trying to head are, I don't know if everyone saw that, this actually I think came out of the Lincoln Lab at MIT, these swarms of drones that can communicate with each other and are much more autonomous, and where you're really trying to set up a system where it kind of goes off and does its own thing, and you overrule it or you intervene when necessary. It is kind of a scary thing. I don't know if it's now kind of an old book, but one of the best first books on it was Daniel Suarez's book, Kill Decision, about these drones that would just kind of go out and use facial recognition and just find their targets and kill them and not phone home. And I think recently there was there are some interesting videos online of examples of this. One of the things that I would point out, and we'll get into this a little bit more later when we talk about things like liability, is you see the terminology is requests and approvals, and then systems that override. And so I think in your readings there is a section that talks about things like nuclear systems, where you override autopilot or the control system of a nuclear thing, and suddenly the minute you've overridden the system, you have some liability issues. And so this kind of adversarial relationship between humans and machines is still very evident here.
Situational awareness or something else?
I think it means situational awareness, yes.
Okay.
So I think the idea, and this is actually a slide, I think, from that I cribbed with permission from the Lockheed Martin Skunk Works folks. But yeah, so I think the idea and the key point is trying to make the humans more about the overview of what's going on rather than sort of individually operating these things. But the thing that I find just personally, and I don't want to be too critical, but when I talk to the military folks, they tend to think in subsystem by subsystem, and so they use the word autonomous as if each subsystem is separate, and they're concerned primarily in things like if two swarms meet each other on the battlefield, how do they identify if they're friend or foe, and how do the targets get going, and how the communications work, and aren't really thinking, at least the people I've talked to, about things like liability so much. And we talked about this yesterday, but just to reiterate, I really don't think there is such a thing as a truly autonomous system, because autonomous sort of means that it's all by itself. When Jonathan Zittrain and I were in Paris, I think it was, having dinner, and I was arguing furiously that nothing is autonomous, and one of our priests said, "Oh, but God is autonomous." I said, "Other than God, nothing is autonomous." And then I was getting quite frustrated with the conversation. Jonathan coined the phrase autonomous systems, which he used yesterday, which is what we're using now, because I think every system is connected to everything else, and I do think words matter. I think that when you start creating departments and creating jobs and grants and things where people are working on autonomous systems, it sometimes starts to feel like they can just not really think about the system. And what you end up with is a system that is pretty out of control or out of context. So I just will reinforce that. Which brings me back to the sort of way zoomed out view, and I want everyone to keep remembering, we're going to go down into subsystems in our conversations, but always remember that everything is connected to everything else, and at the end of the day, you have to think about the climate and the geological scale, as well as sort of the human interactive local scale, and that the interfaces and exchanges matter. But I just sort of want to remind people to zoom out occasionally and remember why we're doing all this stuff. And again, I think it's not a new idea. So Norbert Wiener, it's another slide from the weekend, but humans are part of the system, and I think one of the other really concerning things is a lot of times the digital or mechanical system and the human systems are separated, and you create these interfaces, and that's why you end up with these weird things like override or interface, when they should be much more tightly integrated. And we already know, because in our real life, you sometimes can't tell whether where the machine ends and where the human ends. And in the complex system, it really is a machine of flesh and blood. And again, I'll just try to remind everyone that a lot of the problems and a lot of the learning that we have in the management of machines of flesh and blood actually apply to thinking about autonomous or autonomous AI systems. And one of the, I think, key premises of this course is that machine learning folks, many of you are here, are dealing with things that lawyers and philosophers and others have dealt with human systems. And I think the idea is to see if we can, which frameworks work and how we can integrate some of the ways in which we've learned how to regulate machines of flesh and blood like corporations, or Gary Gensler sitting in the back, markets. Because I think one idea that is interesting, and maybe we'll get somebody to talk about it, I think Deval may have left, but there are some ideas that we might have a society of AIs or a market of AIs, and markets may be one way to think about how a group of machines make decisions rather than this kind of centralized super AI, which is sort of one of the models that people have. And again, just putting this slide back up, as you have divided up into groups, sort of imagine where you are on the spectrum, how much influence you have on technology, law, norms, and markets. And as we dive into the example, especially in this case, we're going to talk about automobiles, we're actually literally facing this problem where the fact that these chunks aren't necessarily well integrated is causing a lot of problems. So I think most of you know this, but this is the way that the US government looks at the levels of automation of automobiles. So normal cars are level 0 and level 1. And then with driver assistance, or like the Guardian system, which I think is a Toyota system, you have more functions like detecting and responding to other vehicles. And then autopilot, which is like the Tesla system. This is level 3, where the driver can, quote unquote, safely turn attention away in limited environments, but still be legally liable for every accident that they get into. And level 4, which is even in extreme weather, they can give away full control. And level 5, you really don't even need the human. And so this is sort of one arbitrary way of describing the level of autonomy. And in the Scalable Cooperation Group, and we have a bunch of them here in this class, they did this project called Moral Machines, where they asked the trolley problem to, how many people now? Does anybody have the number? Is it like, 28 million answers, right? So 28 million people, 28 million of these questions have been asked, and they've got pretty amazing, and I won't have time to show all of the data here, but global data set on how people feel about these things. And there's a lot of criticism about this particular framing of the problem as a trolley problem. Say, well, there's never a case where, you know, I have to make this decision, and so why are we answering this question? This is a useless thought exercise, is often cited. But I think it's important to think about the fact that in daily decision making, if this is a situation where it's not a decision whether you run over an old man or a young child, but that you're driving here and you're the driver, do you lean away from the bike to try to protect the bicyclist a little bit, or do you lean away from the truck to try to protect yourself? And even an inch in either direction is showing a bias towards a certain outcome of whether you're trying to protect yourself or you're trying to protect this bicyclist. So when you actually try to implement some of these trolley problem results, you could sort of theorize that actually the cars do make decisions. And again, this is a slide that I cribbed from the Scalable Cooperation Group. And the study that shows roughly, and this was done before the Moral Machines study, but the surveys showed, and I mentioned this last time, that most people say, you know, everyone should buy one, and I would never buy a car that sacrificed me. And so this gets back to the Lessigonian quadrants, which is you can't just leave it to the market, or you'll end up with a result that's not what people want for society. And in fact, you know, the companies are already starting to think about this. This is a patent from Google, which is literally going through and trying to do exactly what we were saying, like what percentage risk do we attribute to different things getting hit from behind that's protecting me? You know, what about other people? And so when in fact you're actually starting to encode and start to weight the learning systems of these cars, you're making moral decisions. And right now these are encoded into a system that may or may not be visible to us when we're buying the car. But you could imagine, you know, hey, you know, it turns out that if you pay more money, you get more protection, and the cheaper car tends to sacrifice you. But you know what? I'll buy the cheaper car because I can't afford it. So these are questions about whether this should be market driven. And the other interesting thing is how the people believe what's going to happen. So you see, there's a lot of people believe. So this is the number is protect driver at all costs. And then 100, that's 0, and 100 is minimize casualties on the road. So most people believe that we should minimize casualties on the road. But they don't trust the companies to be doing that. They think that the companies are not going to prioritize that in sort of a more flat distribution. So this also starts to show how people believe society works versus how it should be. And should is kind of an interesting word. I know we have some philosophers here. This is also kind of interesting, and I didn't put the slide up, but over the weekend we talked about a coevolution, and we see this in Japan as well. If you actually start driving a Tesla with an autopilot, you start to kind of get a sense of what it is and how it's useful and how it's not. And so what we see is that depending on people's exposure towards it, their excitement about it and their comfort for it changes. So one thing about the Moral Machines experiment, we're polling everyone, including people who've never been exposed to an autonomous vehicle. But if you're working at Google and seeing autonomous vehicles zipping around the parking lot without hitting anybody, you might suddenly start to decide that it's actually okay. So I think the other important thing is that as we go into this, this is all a moving target. So one of the questions is, you know, hey, we need to decide all of our moral things before we even start, versus they may change over time, and how do we be resilient to that, and how do we reflect what society wants?
Feels no fear category. The more exposure you have to them so far, the greater the spread of attitudes where they are both, including a group of people who are much more fearful and much less fearful.
So I don't know the fact, but my intuition around it is whether you've had a scary experience or not. Because if you, I have a Tesla, and and it also depends on your personality, I think, because like I have a pretty good sense of when it's going to be sketchy, and so I turn it on and turn it off. If you have a really scary experience, you get freaked out and never use the autopilot again. I do think also the stuff out there is varying degrees of quality. So for instance, if you're in a Google car that's very expensive with LiDAR, you're going to feel much safer than if you're in some of the commercial versions of some of these things. So I'm not sure exactly how to parse that, but it's an interesting question. It could also be, I don't really know. So I don't know if you guys saw this. I think this was last year, but the Mercedes-Benz manager of driverless safety said, if you know you can save at least one person, at least save that one. Save the one in the car. And you could imagine, and I won't make any stereotypes, but you could imagine that as somebody who's kind of in charge of the car, they know for a fact that they can have the data on whether they can protect that person. And it's kind of like we can put seat belts on, but we can't make people walk more safely. And interesting, by the way, I looked at seatbelt safety. Pedestrian deaths go up when seatbelts come into play. But the number of people who are saved by seatbelts so far exceeds the number of pedestrian deaths that I think we just called it good. But Bruce Schneier has this great story that he tells where he thinks the best thing you could do for road safety is to have a steel spike 1 centimeter from your heart sticking out of the driving column, because you sure will drive safely. And I think one of the problems is...
Sports exam kind of writes itself, though.
Exactly, yeah. But I've been in cars with pretty crazy drivers and said, don't worry, I've got airbags, and so I do think that protecting the driver isn't necessarily a holistically good thing. But as you can imagine what happened, so Mercedes-Benz admits automated car drives will run over a child rather than swerve and risk injuring passengers inside. So I think you have to be very careful what you say, and everyone's paying attention to this. This is going to be a feeder to the liability part that Jonathan's going to talk about. So the guardian angel, which is a Toyota thing, which is basically you driving and the machine assisting, and then the Tesla Autopilot, which is the machine mostly driving with you actively looking over their shoulder, which is sort of layer 3, and the Google car, which really doesn't need the human being. And what is interesting is, and it's not in this slide, but people's sense of who should be responsible roughly maps this. It is interesting also to notice, and I think this is true still, but when I last checked, Tesla makes the driver responsible legally, and I think the European automakers have said that they are liable. So maybe that's also why they protect the driver. But let me see, I think this is a multi-part slide. But this is the National Highway Traffic Safety Association, which is obviously the American point of view. Obviously, ethical considerations are essential, but there's no consensus, and we don't understand this, and there are no metrics to evaluate against. And I think this is just a sense that we're still really trying to figure it out, and they don't really want to take a position on this. And I think because it's America, they're sort of looking to the market, to the industry, to start to figure out whether they can self-regulate. This isn't in your readings, and you can look it up online, but it's pretty interesting. So June, the Germans came out with a direct, I guess this is a report, and it was a pretty interesting report because it was quite diverse in terms of the inputs that they got. They had a Catholic bishop, prosecutor, a judge, auto companies, ethicists, lawyers, engineers, the automotive club.
Can't wait for them all to walk into a bar.
Yeah. But it came out with a pretty interesting set of conclusions, which is, and I think there's some more that I want to read that aren't in there. Well, I don't really understand exactly. So, technology must be designed in such a way that critical situations do not arise in the first place. By the way, so the overall number, I think there's 13 million car deaths a year, and I think they think that autonomous vehicles will eliminate about a million of them. I think that's right. I have to check. I may be wrong. Sorry, but it's substantial enough that And eventually that it'll get rid of 90% of traffic accidents and deaths. Another thing that that's wrong. It wasn't get rid of 1 million. It's get rid of 90%. This is also interesting. So any distinction based on personal features, age, gender, physical or mental constitution is strictly prohibited, which goes squarely against the data that we have from moral machines, which is millions of people saying that they have very specific rank ordering of who they would prefer to run over. And the Germans are saying, no, that's a no-go. General programming to reduce the number of personal injuries must be justifiable. So this gets into the explainability conversation. What does that mean, justifiable? And then parties involved in generation of mobility risk must not sacrifice non-involved parties. So this is interesting because this is sort of saying that because obviously if you're the driver and you're the car, you're the generator of the mobility risk. What is must not sacrifice non-involved party means that the pedestrian, and there's a few others that I wanted to point out that weren't on Yad's slides, but so on data protection, it's pretty interesting. So it says the completely connected and centralized control of all motor vehicles within the context of a digital transportation infrastructure is ethically questionable if, to the extent that it's unable to safely rule out the total surveillance of road users and the manipulation of vehicle control. So that's pretty interesting, and I think this reflects part of Germany's past, probably, which is they don't want a system where somebody that's at the center of the system can monitor and control everyone. It also says it is the vehicle keepers and the vehicle users who decide whether their data that is generated are to be forwarded or used. And according to the Commission, does not become practically compulsory due to normative forces of the factual. And I think that's as the data access by operators of search engines and social networks. So the Germans and the Europeans, I think, are sick and tired of Google and Facebook saying, well, there's no other way to do it, or it already exists. I think they're trying to preemptively come in and say, no, we learned our lesson with the internet. We are not going to let you create a system and then say this is the only way it works. We're going to preemptively come in. So it's really interesting to see the difference between the American approach and the German. And again, this is also key, which is this is Germany, not all of the EU. And so what happens if each country has a different set of rules? How can you, one, train the machine or even do research, and two, how would the machine actually operate in this system? And I don't know if, Jay-Z, you want to take over and...
Well, you tell me if you're in a position to take some notes up on the big screen. Do we have like a template for that? It might be a little tricky.
Yeah, he could have told me a few minutes ago.
I did.
Oh, you did?
Those were good times. So where's our hardware table? Oh, there's more hardware than we thought. This appears to be a locus of hardware. Do there happen to be any car companies among us?
Do you want to try to...
Yeah? Tesla. And do we need to do mic passing if we're recording this? Or
yes, here's the mic.
Oh, there's the box. All right.
You are now on the spot.
Hello.
Hello, Tesla. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Doing great. So you're just sort of throwing cars on the road right now, right? And into space.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People watch the launch of the Roadster into orbit.
And then
True
Elon.
sign of the times, you know, like, cool. Yes. I wondered if it was actually powered by burning money rather than fuel. You could just see the, be more fitting. But I digress. So you got these cars going on the road, and you tell me, as a company, you're about to put some cars into a given country. What's your preference for how bossy you'd like the respective federal ministries of transport and digital infrastructure to be about how those cars should behave?
I mean, because we have L3 cars.
Yes.
I don't think a lot of these rules apply to
I
Tesla
agree.
cars specifically?
But luckily, thanks to a massive set of investments of other people's money, which is usually how it works, you're hitting L4 and L5. Almost sounds like a spinal fracture, doesn't it? Probably is. So you're getting ready to, you've got cars that are capable of discerning objects on the road, navigating around them, doing all the basics that roughly a human driver would do. And you can program it using nicely clumpy units to say, you know, at a stop sign you should stop unless. You can write the if this then that statements in human that the car will be smart enough to more or less deal with, at least as well as a human driver would. Given that you can do that, you can make the car do that, how much freedom do you want as a company to simply write the rules and put the car out versus somehow to be instructed by the government how the car should behave?
I guess ideally we want as much freedom as possible because to make sure that like we ensure the safety of like both the car and like everyone. And also, I think so far, even if we move to more autonomous cars, we will still require the presence of human supervision.
How fast can an L0 Tesla go?
It depends which one.
The Roadster.
I don't know, like.
The answer is 22,000 kilometers per hour.
I don't think so.
Sorry, trick question. A normal Roadster. About how fast do you imagine it can go? And I don't know if somebody is like a huge Tesla fan here. Joey, you've got the family minivan, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so that goes at least 55 miles per hour. But I don't know, how fast can those things move, right?
Yeah.
What? 140 miles an hour. A human driver can take an L0 Tesla up to 140 miles an hour on like the Mass Pike. So tell me, how fast can a human instruct an L5 Tesla to go?
Well, depends on like where the car is, right? If it's on like a German highway.
The Mass Pike. The speed limit. A little help from, what's your interest in this, or just giving a sort of out-of-character assist? So wait, it can only go the speed limit.
I'm actually not sure about this, which is why I was like.
This seems like weird. Like, do we need a Catholic bishop? Like, what? Who do you want to call upon to advise you on answering this? Who will help?
And Jay-Z, I can take notes for you now if you want. Things on this.
Yeah, sure. Joey bought you a little time there. But I'm just asking, who should help? Who should answer this question if you're not feeling, as Tesla, that you know what the answer should be? Who's in a position to answer this for you?
I guess the law or
the law. All right, is the law here? Notice that, by the way, your first instinct was, we want freedom to define what the car does. I asked the most basic question about how the car will behave, and you're like, law? That's good. Sorry, I'm a little punchy. I think it was the fluff in the... Was that a sandwich? I don't know. How would Google classify that? Is it a sandwich? Gretchen, are you going to help out here as a representative of the law? Aha. All right. Oh, wait, we need to toss, or in a safe fashion, get the cube over to you.
All right, representing another automaker that has thought more about this, but I'm from the council's office.
Sick burn on Tesla.
BMW, we are, we're very glad that the German government has come out with strong advice. We want very clear guidance from the government about this because, especially in markets like the American market, there's huge litigation risk. The last thing we want to do is build a car and have it decided 10 years later, after many appeals through the court system, that we did the completely wrong thing. We want to do the right thing from the beginning.
So to the legal systems of the world, you're just like, tell us what to do and what not to do, and that's what we'll do and not do.
Right, and do it
And you are notably then BMW and not VW.
I was careful.
Sorry,
which
a little
car
emissions
company
joke
I
there.
decided to be.
Yeah. All right, so you want to be told what to do. Now, let me ask even a little further than this. This is like an interesting difference in strategies, by the way. One is a company that says, get that pesky regulation off my back, something you hear a lot from companies. The other is, regulate me so that my risk evaporates because I won't be a responsible agent anymore. Both of which are like pretty good, colorable answers for a company to have. Now, I was going to ask a follow-up question, but I'll keep it in mind. Go ahead and tell us whom you represent. Oh.
I'll switch to being Audi.
There appear to be BMW, BMW Prime. Yes.
Surely my position ought to be that I am going to be super proactive and I will be trying to shape the position of various governments. So I will be, along with the Catholic bishop, try and be on the commission.
I love it. This is the best of both worlds. I would like to decide what happens but not be responsible for it.
Absolutely.
Influence the commission. This is called stakeholder press. This is a multi-stakeholder organization that launders the liability through the government. Okay, perfect compromise between these positions. And I was even going to ask, as a further matter, do the hardware folks, for which we now have 2.5 or 3, are you wanting the software folks to somehow be responsible for this? You could build a car that's all hardware and the software module plugs in like an operating system, and then different software companies could write different modules. So it wouldn't just be I have a Tesla driven by or programmed by, name any of a panoply of companies that might step up to do that. How does that sound as an idea to you, BMW Prime?
My first reaction would be that it sounds quite promising, because what that would mean is I could produce one model of my car that functions across all of the markets, and then
yes.
the software companies have to deal with the differentiation. And
right.
So I guess I would have to review exactly how that would work in different legal systems. I'm pretty sure in the German legal system that would work, because I would strongly assume that the liability would end up with the software company.
Right. Another way, that's why I was thinking of it right off of Gretchen's comment. Gretchen is looking skeptical of this. So let's hear her skepticism, and then I'm going to call on the software people to see if they want to write software for a Tesla.
I won't speak to the German case for the law. That may be true. In the American system, we would love it if the liability would stop, but it almost certainly will not stop at the software company. It will come to us. We chose that product to go into our car, and the liability is going to continue to come to us for having made a poor choice. And at the end, especially if their pockets aren't as deep as ours, it will definitely come back to us. In the US, where there are a lot of lawsuits, maybe not in Germany, where there are fewer anyway.
Where are, oh, you're going to answer that, and then let's hear from the software people. But one more post from BMW Prime.
I just wanted to ask, does that apply even if the customer makes that choice, actively 100% makes that choice? It's not like you would suggest to them anything if you 100% leave the choice up to the customer, but where is the law?
I confess, as a torts professor, it does strike me at least that there could be a spectrum that the more the hardware company pulls back from certifying, endorsing, or otherwise selecting the software maker, which might lead to a much more chaotic distribution of cars on the road, because like then we get into open source, right? Are there open source folks or free software advocates here? Like, shouldn't you just be able to code your own car? I don't know. Now it's Gretchen's like, you're telling me there's no liability for the hardware maker if you could just be like 500 miles an hour?
No, I think aftermarket, but we can't be tied to it anyway. Sure, you buy aftermarket stuff, it's written all over the car that, well, don't do that.
Got it.
You open the box, you put other stuff on our car.
Got it. All right, so we've now, that was quick to get rid of the liability you were worried about. Where are our software folks? Is there a software table? Over there. All right, so, whoa. I love how Gretchen's all worried about legal liability and then she hurls the cube at the software table. Like, do as I say, not as I do. So, software table, who wants to step up to write the app called Drive on top of the car called Tesla or BMW? Tell us who you are. Arjun.
Hi, I represent Microsoft, which right now is not in the space, but you know.
This is Microsoft, you say?
Yes.
Microsoft, got it. I
Um,
appreciate your Surface.
So I think to the extent software companies are working on embedding software into these vehicles, like what the best you can do is meet the specification that's provided by whoever's making that vehicle or the legislators. And I mean, to the extent software companies should be liable, it would seem like it's, I mean, we have some, like we write the code, we might do some testing, but it really shouldn't be on our burden to like, as long as we're in compliance with the rules, whether set by law or by
Okay, but for these path-breaking companies, especially like Tesla that never found a rule it didn't want to break, and Microsoft had its young randy days as well, for these companies, it's a little bit timorous to be like, the opening thing is all about our liability and how do we avoid it. You know, if you're not accruing liability, you might not be accruing money in a market. So tell me, do you want, as Microsoft, to be able to have like a Microsoft app that provides a driving experience that you think you will outcompete that of Apple or anybody else at this table that wants to write software for your car?
So I would say our core competency is not in these underlying safety systems that go into the automotive space. I think there's a wide range of software that can be in these cars.
You basically want to like do Winamp for the radio of the car,
Yes,
like, or something like that. Yes.
Yeah, apps maybe like the OS level that's one layer above safety critical systems might be a place where companies like us could compete.
You're not wanting to write the assistant like, it looks like you're driving, do you want help with that?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's Microsoft's out of that business. Any other software folks that want to step up, or are you feeling the way Microsoft does?
Hi, I'm representing Facebook. I'm Mark Zuckerberg. And
can you see him already drunk on power?
We think of the car experience as a social experience that connects people. And we imagine of course, we know that these technologies will develop to a point where it will be L4 and 5. And in which case, we would like to build apps on top, like at the highest layer, that gives a very pleasant experience. Basically, what people want in their car to do. Being connected to other cars, I don't know, like this is something we're figuring out.
Wait, so this is basically, you want to follow the pattern of Facebook of starting out with something that sounds completely pointless but ends up dominating the world. Because it doesn't sound like you want Facebook driving the car. My pitch to get the software people to write the driving code appears to be falling completely flat.
We won't take, so we believe that like, we won't take liability. We think that people are responsible for what they do on our platform.
Would a Facebook car, which is to say Facebook software running on some of this hardware here, how fast would it be able to go? I can't believe this is a killer question.
I think, we think that it should be driven by the dynamics of the autonomous cars eventually. Of how the cars interact with each other in a system where they drive autonomously and safely.
I love it. The answer is we don't know how fast it will go. It will be an emergent property of a system that we will build and then walk away from. Kathy, shall I do a underhanded lob?
Well, we'll share. We came up with a new category. It was
Tell us who you are.
This is, I'm currently an unnamed, not yet identified, soon-to-be famous software engineer. And we came up with the category of disruptors / criminals / activist as our table category, since we don't actually have one. And Bobby can probably explain it better, our role.
So we were thinking we can build a software-defined radio for like less than $100 and intercept all the software apps and the signals of what's happening, and like really try to create a use case where we can demonstrate that all these relationships we're talking about are really not functional, and the civic movement, like the public, needs to take their like responsibility to kind of hold each stakeholders accountable.
So just to make it a little more concrete, as L5 cars start rolling out somehow, what do you want to do to them?
We'll be hacking them.
Hacking the cars.
Yes.
And doing what with them when you hack them?
So we intercept the signals and just like make a lot of noise in the software-defined radio field, so that
Make the cars like form out funny messages as they park with one another, or something harmless but chaotic.
yeah.
Okay, you are chaotic neutral, it sounds like, if we're in the alignment process of Dungeons and Dragons. Whereas this another hardware intervention, and then I want to turn to the United States government.
This is Samsung. As the maker of the hardware that goes into some of these cars, including the camera, etc., we have an alternative point of view on whether we want to be platform agnostic or not. So as the hardware maker, we are the means by which data is collected in these cars, and as we know, data is the gold rush of AI. So we would like to absolutely have a say in who we sell our hardware to which platform. We're happy to take some liability if that means a cut of some of the profits from the data.
Got it. So as a upstream part of the supply chain, you'd like there to be the patina of competition, say, between BMW, and Tesla, but it's really all Samsung underneath. You're the Intel inside of the car.
Yes, but not just for the car. But
You're also getting all the data.
Yes.
Got it. All right, that's somewhat ominous. Shall we hear from
Can
the
I
United...
ask a question? Did
Yeah, of course.
anybody pick hardware or software companies who are actually doing this, right? So there's like NVIDIA, which is making the hardware. There's
Well, they may have been
Mobileye.
not wanting to be stuck with it all term.
But I guess I'm just making the meta point that,
Yes.
that I think we picked the companies that aren't actually the ones doing the things
Correct.
that you're suggesting somebody might do.
Yes.
But I think I think it's important to point out that there is a battle going on
Yes.
vertical integration, and the liability thing is, and again, I'm doing the meta comment, it's actually a live issue, and it's pretty interesting.
Yes.
And I think what people are trying to do is to own as much as they can and take as little liability as they can, as you could imagine would be
Yes.
a normal thing to do. But it's a big deal about what layer you're going to be at, and there's a project that we've been involved in a little bit on all these different data providers trying to share data.
Yes.
Because there's also this really interesting thing about how many millions of miles you have to actually drive in order to collect enough data to do X, Y, and Z.
Right.
So there's also the people who create the data. And sorry, I'm going to make one last final meta comment, which is the problem is that if somebody gets in an accident, forgetting the legal part, it could be the car, it could be the person, the software way that it's been written, it could be the algorithm for the training, it could be the engineer who did the training, it could be the underlying data. So the real responsibility is actually smeared across a number of companies regardless of where the legal liability is. And in the readings you saw with the, for instance, with the Air France crash, it was actually a faulty sensor. Obviously, the airline is in charge of that in that case. But we see this in the real world already, and I think typically, I think it was, to your point, the biggest cash pot usually is the one that gets sued. But these ecosystems are actually happening.
Yes. And it's funny, it is worth talking about liability. I can't help, again, thinking about, say, the history of tort law, to think about how often there ends up being some massive technological or industrial advance, think the railroad, and not a ton of thought about liability. The legal system scrambles to figure out when is the railroad going to be accountable for the accidents it causes. And by the time it's going, there may be some sense in the legal system that you don't want to kill the goose laying golden eggs, so they will come up with doctrines that are more abstemious than you might think. But the other thing here is how much we want to bring the composition of the existing transportation sector to this new sector. When you think of a car, there is a basic format for the way a car, a regular L0 car, hits the road. Like BMW builds the thing, and maybe they put in a radio from, these days, there's like AirPlay or CarPlay or whatever, or there's an Android equivalent. But there is basically integration where you don't have an operating system with different apps on it. But given that this represents in some ways just like, for instance, borrowing from internet structure or from the software industry, you could, if you wanted, and this now turns me back to the government folks, whether foreign or US, in our tables, to say, do these governments, even upstream from the decisions we saw the German Commission starting to feel its way into weighing in on, And these are pronouncements often in the passive voice. A car should, kind of thing. I think there's the upstream question of, do these governments have a stake in what the shape of the entire market and technology looks like? Do they want open source cars? Do they not? Do they want one manufacturer or 2 or 18? Do they have any view on that? So I don't know. Where is Team America World Police?
One last thing before you drift away too far from liability, because this is also the readings about the moral crumple zone.
Yes.
So I think it's really important that increasing complexity is a qualitative change. So if you're in a bicycle, you roughly know what's going on. In an old car, I remember tuning my car on the side of the road. I roughly knew what I was going on. But more and more fly-by-wire planes, we had in the readings a nuclear reactor. You really don't know what's going on, but you're still responsible. And in the readings, the point was that they're still pushing the responsibility of these failures on human beings who really can't rationally get their head around it. And I think the interesting thing is, again, this is about interface design, not just literally who's in control. Yes. And I think the problem with a lot of these systems is that there is an incentive to keep pushing the liability, both legally and sort of normatively, on the human in the loop, the drone operator,
yes.
the 3 Mile Island engineers who screwed it all up, when actually it could have been very different depending on the design.
But the wise folks who wrote that paper probably are shining the way towards, all right, let's not just look for the nearest hapless human, but there really will be some sense of systemic responsibility, or as they advocate for, no fault. Like, we'll come up with something that isn't a traditional liability regime, but is a form of risk spread insurance, so that when injuries happen as a result of the technology, people get compensated, but we look for other ways to incent safe behavior than a liability rule. We have a transportation commission, we order them, and if you break the order, you go to jail. There are lots of different ways to get safety into a system if you want. So where's Team America? Boy, Team America's feeling pretty laconic this evening. Anybody want to offer up a view as to whether you want to answer the plaintive question of Tesla, which is like, you tell me how fast my car can go if the person inside orders it to go a certain speed? Anybody want to answer that question? And tell us who you are.
Thank you. So I'm the Department of Justice.
The Department of Justice?
Yeah. So it's a fairly narrow perspective. I guess that my other colleagues from other branches of the government will be able to contribute other perspectives.
And what's your concern here? What's the Department of Justice's concern or role?
I mean, so one concern, with regards to the, traffic regulation on the road, I guess my perspective would be that initially there's no reason to deviate from existing rules and to continue enforcing existing speed limits.
Well, right, but I'm asking how fast the car can go, and existing rules are, it's perfectly legal for General Motors to build a car, or Tesla to build a car, that if you press the accelerator down and keep your foot there, it'll go 140 miles an hour. So is it okay to simply say, fine, you're not pressing the accelerator, but if you tell the car, warp factor 8 and step on it, the car will obey you as it would if you press the pedal. Is that the status quoism you want?
So the question is whether it should be illegal to build cars that have that ability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Tesla was like, just tell me what to do.
Well, Tesla has a mode called insane mode, which is insanely
Talk
fast.
about something that was not vetted with the lawyers.
And by the way, the Tesla, the current interface is you actually set how much above the speed limit you want it to allow you to go without even warning you.
Yes.
And there's also another, just a meta point, which is, and I think it may be an urban myth, but it's roughly accurately true. I think there was a bunch of complaints about this, everyone going over the speed limit on the New Jersey Turnpike.
Yes.
And at least the story goes, I was looking for the citation, I couldn't find it, but that the state police chief had state troopers drive at exactly the speed limit, and they had sort of hours of traffic.
Yes.
And they said, okay, fine. And so I think one of the other really interesting points, I think in many roads, I think the police know that if everyone drove exactly the speed limit,
yes,
society wouldn't function.
Yes.
So there's another that's just...
Which illustrates the point that
And this is, by the way, I'll say one more thing. When I bought the new Tesla, this was the ad for the new Tesla, and it said, you have all of the hardware you need for this. All we need to do is more software upgrades and a few regulatory twiddles. And they said this was coming to this will be, your car is now capable of this, was the ad. It's actually on their page. And then NVIDIA, which makes the system, which they have too, they said, no, in fact, no, you'd need to get new hardware. So but this is what they were pitching the last series of cars with this as the advertisement.
I love the idea that thanks to that table over there, the car is mining Bitcoin, and it's just like stopped at a stop sign, trying to do some cryptocurrency. All right, so from Joey's intervention so far, Joey, are you saying that if you were to set the car to go to 140, it would go to 140?
So it changes now. So they've started to, initially so as I drive, what's interesting is that, first of all, depending on the street.
It does look like the driver was just kidnapped.
Depending on the street now, the Tesla does all kinds of automatic things. It'll say you can't auto drive on the street. On this street, sometimes it's more fussy about the speed. So I think what it's doing is it's collecting data and kind of making up its own mind about the safety of the road.
Yes. So how interesting. First, you made the point with the New Jersey story of the troopers that there was already a kind of normative layer on top of L0 cars about how people chose to drive, and people got used to that. It's true. On the New Jersey Turnpike, if you drive the speed limit, you will get rear-ended. It's like affirmatively dangerous to go the speed limit. It calls to mind George Carlin's observation that on the highway, anybody driving slower than you is an idiot, and anybody driving faster than you is an asshole. And you're just like, can you see that idiot? What's wrong with him? And this asshole, look how fast they're going. It's only people that drive exactly your speed that are normal. But somehow, am I right that something feels different about a car that you can step on the pedal and go as fast as you want from a car that is largely autonomous and you can instruct it, go 140 and it will? Does it feel like the car maker has more responsibility for the second kind of car than the first? And if so, why? And I'm asking the Department of Justice, and so far I haven't discerned your position on this.
So I'm not sure I share that sentiment. Maybe I'm in a minority position within my, I'd have to consult with my colleagues in the department.
Well, the department's reputation is in tatters, I'm
yeah.
Sorry.
I think my perspective on it would be to try to assess whether with the rollout of autonomous cars that have that ability, there's going to be a change in risky behavior on the road. And that's going to be relevant. If there isn't, I don't think I would necessarily have a problem with that.
Other views from the American table, or should we move to the foreign governments? Boy, America needs to be FOIA'd to spit up any information. Where are the foreign governments? Over here. All right. Who wants to speak up? We're hungry for regulation.
Sure. So I'm representing South Africa. So thinking about it from a little bit of a different perspective, it seems though the question about speed limit really comes down to the basic reason for having self-driving cars. If you're thinking about it as providing an increase in safety and providing something that we don't currently have in our current driving model, then it seems like the speed limit question should fit into the either improve upon our safety as it is now or improve upon and innovate in some way this idea of a speed limit and how it works with society. And so it seems as though you almost have this new category where it's kind of a public transportation or something that exists in a public consciousness, that it seems more so like like you would think about the subway, or something that exists outside of just the individual agent or individual driver and ownership. And so I think when you think about how you're regulating speed limits or any of the laws around that, you should think about it as improving upon the current safety models that we have. So I think about infrastructure. How is it relating to the ways in which urban planning has constructed the city? There's a larger conversation across the society that is now housing that public good, as opposed to just the individual car makers or individual drivers.
Fascinating intervention, and it suggests, first you're saying, depending on where you turn the dial, you could end up with different answers. It's systemically, what are you trying to optimize for now that there's technology that can capture some surplus from chance what do you want to do with it? And it also sounded like maybe you were suggesting that to the extent that we think of a car not as just a car the way we think of it, hey, I bought a car, now I get to drive it, but it's just one unit in a nodal system, it's starting to sound like Facebook, of lots of cars that are working in some form of tandem in relationship to one another, the less idiosyncratically any one unit can behave, perhaps the more harmonious the whole system would be, which in that case might suggest smooth out those edges of 140 miles an hour or so. You know, the car maybe should go at a typical rate and you can vary it just a little bit within it depending on how much of a hurry you're in. Yes?
Speaking for China, I want to agree with what our friends from South Africa said. I think that that illustrates why we need strong centralized control.
Uh-huh. How China of you. Yes? And therefore what? Would you want to just instruct the car makers flat out about all sorts of things, basically write the code for them? You're the software maker?
Sort of. We sort of are.
Uh-huh.
Our industries are very, very tightly, we have a very strong relationship with our industries. And we think this is an advantage precisely so that we can work with all the parts of the system to make sure that everything will work together.
Got it.
In precisely the way that my friends from South Africa are saying is desirable. This is part of the problem that happens when you have this free-for-all in places like the US.
Uh-huh. Why don't I stop with Hallie on my way to the civil society table. Is this a civil society table? This appears to be hardware makers. It depends.
Floating on the edges of all of the things.
So what role do you represent?
Ooh.
This was supposed to have been predetermined to some sense.
Assemblers were not given roles.
Ah,
yeah.
That explains it all.
No, so,
no, good for you guys. All right.
But
so,
we feel like talking anyways.
Yeah, go for it.
No, okay, so two things, and they're different, so I can't pick a role. Sorry for throwing this off. But what about the fact that weren't a lot of cars, aren't speed limits also a function of like the safety precautions in terms of if a car gets in a crash and it's driving at a certain speed, aren't you less likely to cause deaths? And in terms of hitting pedestrians in certain places, so I'm wondering where in the sense of how we think about who makes these decisions, and it's not just about how fast can it go, but how fast should it go, which is not just an arbitrary speed limit, but one that also was designed with like public health consequences.
Well, that sounds a lot like what Joey was describing, where the Tesla gets more and more idiosyncratic to our eye, but quite controlled to its eye about how it will go.
And I just noticed that they changed the name from insane mode to ludicrous mode recently.
Well, I'm glad the lawyers got to them to get them to pick a more reasonable name. It really is almost a like, please sue me mode. Yeah, that's crazy. Or ludicrous.
The other thing which may come up with the civil society, but I also am wondering who is going to be responsible. I don't know, maybe I'm speaking as the ethical angel / devil. Who is going to be responsible for the jobs that are displaced with the development of autonomous vehicles? And if that's a question we want to ask ourselves in the context of ethics and autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, we have a
labor union leader.
That sounds great. I'll be the labor union leader.
I was recently at a conference where there was a labor union leader who represents some global union that he said had tens of millions of people in it. I forget what it was. He was from the UK. And he was gravely concerned about AI, but had not yet zoned in on exactly what his worry was. We do have a day coming up, I think, on labor, do we not?
And we have EAD coming in for that.
So yes, so that'll be taken up then. But
a majority of states, I'm going to get the statistic wrong, but in a majority of states, there is a majority of people who are employed as truckers.
Plurality.
So, plurality, yes.
That's a big difference,
right,
plurality versus majority, yes.
I was going to use it, I didn't want to use it wrong, so I used it wrong instead in the other way. But yeah, so there's a plurality of folks who are truck drivers, and so I'm just wondering if we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, I think we absolutely will. So where's the civil society table? Hello, civil society. who wants to speak up on whether civil society has a stake in general questions about between government and industry who gets to program the car? I thought that was Arnold Schwarzenegger, but it was Elon Musk. Anybody want to offer a view? Which civil society group do we have? Amy.
I am EFF. So
Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Yes, we are anti-surveillance. We also believe in the ability for people, the right for people to tinker with and inspect the things that they buy, including cars, and that data collected on us should not be used against us, and the ability to be anonymous.
Got it. Also, by way of disclosure, I'm on the board of EFF, but that will not...
As well as on the advisory board of the NSA.
Thank you, Joey.
Just to balance it out.
Hadn't come up yet, but can't hurt to mention that as well. So it does lead to some weird moments, I agree, between the two organizations, which are suing one another. But your middle point about tinkering, does this right to tinker then, in your view, EFF, extend to, hell yeah, it ought to be able to go to 140, and of course if you're willing to just like flip a bit that ought to be well documented for you to flip, let the car go to warp factor 9?
Yes, I believe that that should be allowed. It is a product that I have purchased, or I being the consumer,
yes,
have purchased, and therefore I should be able to not only inspect the software, but be able to edit it or repair it.
And you also want to make sure that there's no tracking of any kind done of the users or passengers of the car?
Yes, so if I choose to go above the speed limit, and this should not be something that is held against me because of some surveillance system that can detect that I'm going above the speed limit.
But it's fair and square for the cat to try to catch the mouse the old-fashioned way. You're not just lawless. You're saying that if you go above the speed limit and they catch you fair and square with like a regular old radar gun or by following you, then you can be arrested.
Yeah, that's fine.
They're just not allowed to know, even though they could, that you went 140 miles an hour. Sorry, you've got to mean it. How about the possibility that somebody could, I guess if it's an autonomous vehicle, there doesn't need to be any passenger whatsoever in it. Do you have the freedom? Is it an important freedom to be able to send the car off to go pick up something at Costco to be loaded in the trunk, and you don't even have to be in it?
I think that should be fine, subject to regulations. So
that's a big asterisk.
Similar to like if I decide to buy a drone or something, I need to license my drone. And
yeah, EFF was not so happy about that drone licensing requirement. But it does get to exactly the safety question I was raising, because the next question I was going to ask is, what if somebody puts something explosive in the trunk, sends it off unoccupied to its enemy's destination? The first time that happens, what's our government tables? What will they want?
They're going to want the records of everybody.
Yeah. Is EFF going to be like, no, can't have them?
Yes.
Yeah. Will they win?
We will fight it.
Yeah. Probably not. Other public interest? Whoa.
I'm Heather. I'm from the ACLU. And I don't have specific feelings about the autonomous vehicle going off by itself to a store or something, but I do have feelings about decision-making of cars in terms of accidents, especially when they get to the L5 level. We know that in moral decision-making, humans tend to be biased toward in-groups members, and at the ACLU, we think it's very important that autonomous vehicles not have the same biases we know are prevalent in human decision-making.
And you didn't have the benefit of having been assigned the German Transport Ministry document, but you saw that summary that Iad had, where Elon is still talking, but there was somewhere. Joe, you were taking notes when I last checked in.
There you go.
Now he's just letting YouTube's AI direct him ultimately, right, to like the moon landing was fake.
You said you wanted to take notes.
I think I said I wanted notes to be taken.
No.
Yeah.
It's not autonomous.
Too bad. Any distinction based on personal features is strictly prohibited. Are you down with that then? That sounds like...
That's correct.
Yeah, good. Anything you would add to that? Or is that pretty much capturing it?
Well, I think that because of that standard, it makes it important to have strong regulations about the kind of software that can be put into these autonomous vehicles. I think it's important that it's not open source, so that people can decide to code their own sense of morality into the vehicle.
You do want that or you don't?
I don't want
You don't want that?
Yeah.
That
Because
would be a civil liberties infringement to let people exercise their own morality.
Well, I think it would be protecting the groups of people that are generally discriminated against.
Yes.
And protecting minorities rather than
Yes.
the majority.
I think it's actually entirely possible that the ACLU would be kind of confused on this. And not because they're addled, but because it's genuinely confusing if you're trying to adopt a civil libertarian perspective. It's how much is it about the individual freedom, autonomy of a person, say, to discriminate, if he or she wants, versus bias is an invidious problem in society. People's rights are infringed when it happens. It usually happens as much one individual to another as it does government. And you can see being quite conflicted about that exactly on the point of whether cars should be able to be coded to the predilections and biases of their owners. I saw some other hands up. Hello, hello.
You're not throwing it up. Okay, good.
I was not throwing.
My hand-eye coordination's really bad. Okay, I'm Amazon, and who doesn't want Alexa in their car? But if I can,
that was a rhetorical question. Don't answer it.
Don't answer that. If I can, I'd like to break out of my role a little bit as Amazon to talk about the accessibility of these cars. So the blind community, which I know a lot about as the resident blindy in the room, is really excited about the possibility that of self-driving cars, because it would give someone who's blind the ability to like drive places, and is therefore pretty concerned about any legislation that might go through that would make it so that there had to be a licensed driver behind the wheel of a self-driving car, even if there isn't a wheel. And also concerned that wants the software to be accessible so that it can be used by someone who's blind.
And might there be also some sense of urgency that to the extent that we see the cube getting passed back and forth between hardware and government, say, as to who should be making the rules, would it be your perspective that's like, I don't care, but let's get them made and get the cars going as soon as possible?
I don't know if it's an as soon as possible thing so much as it's being developed and as the rules are being made, like organizations like the National Federation of the Blind really want their view to be heard and respected, and want the people with disabilities who will really benefit from these cars to have a voice.
And the question I'm about to ask is not exactly on point, but it has to do with our sense of equality and accessibility. And it may be back to the civil libertarians. How readily should you be able to buy your way to a faster car or a shorter trip? You could imagine, for example, being able to program the car if you deposited a quarter to just get there faster. And the other cars, actually, if they are not willing to pay that much, they part like the Red Sea and let the higher paying car go by. And that might be reflected then in a lower total cost of ownership of your car, because some of the money to be captured will be captured through those that want to pay for premium service. Any views on whether that should be permitted?
Sounds like a highway.
It sounds like a highway. A toll highway, you mean? You want to take the cube?
Yeah, we have all different ways of stratifying people based on how much they can pay.
And are you speaking from your role or just as a driver that wants to use the fast lane?
I'm the CEO of Tencent, Pony Ma, so head of a Chinese tech company. So
and you're very wealthy.
I am very wealthy. But yeah, good. It's even better in my role, actually.
But notice that like creating a toll lane and a regular lane requires a ton of fixed infrastructure. People have to get used to it. You have to designate where the toll readers are going to go. Here, you could, on the fly, have dynamic spread spectrum, as it were, toll lanes, because some cars would just pull over as you're supposed to do for an ambulance to let the car go through. And you're saying that's good.
Yeah, I think from our perspective, the more we can have people have different choices of what they want to spend, the more we'll be able to have this kind of technology and others available to the most number of people.
Other views on this question? A civil libertarian is wanting to weigh in.
Hi, I'm New America. First of all, we would like to say that we strongly believe in highway neutrality. We don't specifically believe...
You don't like paid prioritization.
Exactly. It's a metaphor that translates very literally. On top of that, we would like to argue that we are somewhat concerned that this whole thing is moving rather too fast, and that various companies in this room have trained their cars on public data without any prior consent from the parties involved. And secondly, we're pretty concerned that the privatization of...
How are those parties that apparently contributed to the public data, how are they being injured if the data is producing safer, cooler cars that they have an equal opportunity to buy? What's the injury?
Well, the injury hasn't happened yet, but it's the possibility of the injury, at least for us.
Tell me what the injury is. What is this hypothetical injury?
For example, it might refer to the both literal and moral crumple zone. That there's sort of unforeseen consequences to these autonomous systems that we haven't yet envisioned or thought through.
But that's not then a privacy invasion of the people whose data ended up in the data set. That's just, we're being too reckless about this.
Sure, it's maybe both. It's a privacy issue on the part of data protections, and it's also a temporal issue in the sense that development has gone too fast.
How would you know when development is not going too fast? What's the metric you would use, knowing that NHTSA was one of the folks, the Highway Safety Administration, it was like, we don't even have metrics for this stuff. How will we know when we're ready?
I'm honestly not sure. I think I'll know it when I see it.
Spoken like the New America Foundation, if I don't say so myself. Were there other views on the paid prioritization question? Yes, I will walk it over. If you want to pay a little more, I'll throw it.
I'm a partner at a lobbying firm working for a trucking group, and we think paid prioritization would sort of reduce our competitiveness or create hurdles that would essentially slow down the American economy, and we don't...
How interesting. I honestly could not predict the end of your sentence once you'd begun it. I thought you might be like, great, if we've got sorghum, we can just go in the regular lane, but if we've got like some neat, tight supply chain thing for which the client wants to pay more, great, and we can charge them more and go faster.
Physics, our trucks can't go as fast as nimble cars. And so, especially crossing mountainous terrain, we are...
You just want to make sure everybody else moves as slowly as you do?
We don't want to be burdened with extra traffic caused by cars being able to drive faster in stretches of road where they can.
Well, but then if you're a lobbyist, you should use your lobbyist's imagination and be totally into paid prioritization and just have an exception for trucks that will never have to slow down. You're welcome. Pretty good. Can I just take a sense of the room now? Let's just be ourselves. How many people are liking the paid prioritization idea? How many people are not liking it? All right, so there are a little more status quoists among us, but there was still a kind of decent number of people also in favor of it. And can I just say, if the prioritization were because the person in the car were willing to declare an emergency and just put the car into take me to the hospital mode, let me just see how many people would be open to that, even if it would inconvenience you. How many people say no, no hospital mode in the car? Fascinating. I see, there's, oh, wow. All right, so let's hear from our former banker why there should not be a hospital mode for the car.
Well, in the mode, actually, this is the criminal table, remember?
You're the hackers, sorry, yes.
The hackers, I represent WikiLeaks, actually.
Why doesn't WikiLeaks want an emergency mode in the car? It seems like it could help in the Ecuadorian embassy.
Well, it just seems that, you know, when a peacock can be a support animal on an airplane, we have to have some, it can't? Yeah, it's just an observation that we have to be careful. So I'm definitely for somebody who...
You're worried about abuse of emergency mode.
Abuse of emergency mode.
Just like people in Washington abuse the Dulles toll road when they're not really going to Dulles Airport.
That's right. And from...
Can't tell if you're applauding the idea of abusing the road or finally somebody spoke out against this outrage.
Yeah. But what we would do at WikiLeaks is we would try our best. We would try our best to get the software companies and the hardware companies code and make it transparent to the public. So the public could really see what the biases are in the code.
Got it. I should also note that if there is worry about abuse of emergency mode, again, we start to be able to write any amount of code once we get the idea that we are not just replacing human drivers with a robot decision maker at the wheel. It's an entire system we can program. If somebody declares an emergency in the car, you could either have a cry wolf function that you only get to use it 3 times, just like hyperspace on asteroids. At some point, you won't be allowed to do it anymore without blowing up. It's a really old reference.
So if we can assure no peacocks in the airplane, I'm with it.
Well, you'd have some form of accountability that would be like, did the car stay at the hospital for a certain period of time after it declared the emergency and got there?
And Jay-Z, I would point out that car navigation is already facing this, right? So Waze now, I don't know if you've noticed that Waze now has a setting to try to reduce dangerous intersections.
Yes.
Because I think there's a criticism that optimizing just for how fast you get there
might mean a ton more turns.
Right, and actually increase your risk. There's a liability. And then also in some countries like Japan, where they have very centralized, nationally run navigation data systems, the police actively use them to sort of move traffic one way or another, or make paths and roads and stuff like that. So it's car navigation it's kind of, again, machines of flesh and blood.
Yes.
If you're an Uber driver and you're using Waze, you're probably going to, especially if you've got a passenger, it's almost like an autonomous vehicle to the extent that the path that you take is
and you just wait for the phone to tell you where to go.
By Google.
So in the law enforcement context, how about an arrest mode for the car? Warrant is issued over the objections of the EFF. We can, with a warrant, find out if somebody is in a car at the moment the warrant is issued, or wait to see if they should get into one. And when they do, the doors will lock and the car will escort them at a decent, generous speed to the nearest police station. Right? How many people are in favor of arrest mode? Really? Yes, I already put in the warrant requirement. Absolutely. This is a warrant issued by a magistrate. There's judicial review. We had the ACLU review it, and they're
And there's a derivative mode, which is the hit and run mode. So if you have a car and you do a hit and run, should the car notify the police?
Yeah, Ryan, let's get the box over to you. I think it's still in the other corner. Route it.
Yeah, so I think this problem turns a little bit on the ownership structure. So in the event that this is my car that I have purchased and it's mine, just like the FBI can't make my laptop take webcam photos of me without a warrant, you probably can't go after my car.
It's so funny because you thought that was like placative and making people feel better, and everybody's just like, wait, the FBI with a warrant can make my laptop take photos of me? Just like that?
But maybe the far more likely situation here is that you have a large ride-hailing network, in which case it seems to me that Waymo, served with an arrest warrant, could be compelled to do exactly that.
And how would you feel about that?
That's kind of the risk you take by going on Waymo's service. I mean, maybe there's a certain degree.
Or perhaps what you've earned by committing some horrendous crime?
Or you can't afford to buy a car.
Right.
So therefore, people who can afford to evade the dragnet are in paid prioritization mode, and that's the problem.
I mean, to a large extent, you're not going to be able to prevent the creation of a God mode, per se. Right? Waymo is going to have the capability to monitor its vehicles.
But the German directive explicitly prohibits that.
Maybe in the German context, but it's probably not prohibited in the U.S. And
Natalie? Uber drivers. I don't know. Do the hardware makers, there's like Tesla, do you care about this? Or are you just like, tell me what the car should do? Electra and Tesla?
I guess my general take on this is it's on the buyer and the user, and that we should respect the privacy of the user, essentially, and the owner of the car.
But Ryan's point was, once you've got process and you've got the warrant issued and everything, isn't it just the police kind of, it's the first half of a Law and Order episode. They just go from one private party to another and kind of schmooze with them and then get a warrant and then get data so that you can have the second half hour of the trial. Well, that appears to be a rejection of my question. Electra, no, go ahead, Electra.
Okay. So Wajia and I represent Apple, and we actually wanted to lend support to EFF and say that we have a solution. We are elaborating a fully encrypted end-to-end software solution, fully controlled by the customer. So hopefully governments will not be able to track our customers and where they are and locate them.
And you think Apple's principles that are very well advertised as a competitive advantage around communications and information privacy should seamlessly extend to an ability to be a fugitive from the law on a moving vehicle?
So we are exploring the legal intricacies of this aspect. But our belief is that our customers really want fully encrypted solutions, also in the automotive space. They've expressed a real support for it in this sort of mobile space, and we believe in this.
And contrary to what Joey's represented, the German government is wanting, if there should be a move not to identify or deal with one individual car. I see how Apple, at least extending its, FBI, iPhone encryption battle to this could work. But if they want to do it generally so that the next hurricane bearing down on Houston allows the mayor, who previously did not order an evacuation because evacuations of non-autonomous vehicles goes very poorly. People are not at their best. There's actually much more hazard to be unprotected on the road. So they just don't order the evacuation. But here, potentially you could. You could just have all the autonomous vehicles be like, all right, like load in a suitcase, you've got 10 minutes, and then this escape pod is closing the doors and walking, not running, to a safe location. Would you be okay with that? Having your cars be commandeerable with the right legal process for public safety purposes?
So this is a topic that we don't like to speak publicly about.
i.e. nearly every topic, if you're Apple.
But we, at times, are in conversations with governments, and if this is to the benefit of our customers, we might be more open towards some compromises.
And Jason, can I say?
Oh yeah, sure. Why don't you say, well, what's over here?
Just something worth looking at. I was talking to somebody. I think it's China, but it may be a specific city. They are now implementing a very strict. So the jaywalking was a big problem. People getting hurt. So then the cars now, if you literally go onto the crosswalk line when there is a person, the cars get automatic tickets. So they're now using surveillance to give people tickets. When they do any sort of minor infraction, including rolling over a line when there's a pedestrian. And what's happening now is that the pedestrians know, so they're just on their phones.
They just waltz in front of the car.
Waltz in front of the car, and on a crosswalk that is in front of a train station, cars can't pass. And so now cars are avoiding places where they know they can't. So and again, this will obviously evolve, but what's quite interesting as we start to think about autonomous vehicles that are subject to control, you have pedestrians who aren't, right? So on the one hand, sacrificing pedestrians may happen as an issue, but when you have controlled versus non-controlled things mixing, you have this very weird moral Crumple zone where you could sort of do weird things with impunity.
And strange second-order effects that come about that you wouldn't maybe have predicted. You really have to have a lot of prevision.
And
I mean,
this gets into this whole adversarial thing, right? So
Yes.
like kids with craft paper stop signs and things like that, just all kinds of attacks to systems that are coded to behave a certain way in an understandable fashion.
Which is a kind of very humbling warning that it's easy for us to think about the driver of a car as some slob who might be intoxicated, not paying attention, listening to the radio. Like, it may, in 20 or 30 years, seem bizarre that like every car we see out this window might be one that's like just driven by some random person. My God, how did we cross the street?
Well, my
fear,
prediction is that fun to drive will be like smoking cigarettes in commercials. Because if you think the main high-level factor, which we can't forget, is that it can reduce traffic accident deaths by 90%, according to certain projections. So that means anything that gets in the way of the march forward of autonomous vehicles, especially once one city has gone fully autonomous, will sound like you're killing people, just like cigarettes did. So that's the broader argument.
But unlike the banning of cigarettes, I think my point was we're revealing the prospect of second-order effects that we might not anticipate, no matter how carefully we plan, made possible by the prospect of centralized control over a pervasive system that, you know, gosh, we really don't know where we're headed. Somehow banning cigarettes seems much simpler than this kind of regulation that especially I've been proposing that goes beyond, again, just replacing a human driver with a robotic one. Yes?
I'm Joe the coal miner, and I've never worked at a big company or been contacted by an NGO. I'm just kind of regular guy, and I lost my job, and all these things sound really nice, but you know, I don't think I'll be able to ever afford a car like the ones you guys are talking about. And I was wondering if buses will exist, and if we could fix a lot of the problems you guys are talking about.
Yeah, I mean, that's often, there are a number of municipal transport advocates. This also gets back to the point that we were hearing from the South Africa representative. It may well be that if you think of the cars as part of a municipal transport system and accessibility remains the touchstone, this could make buses that much cheaper. It could provide for, quote, bus routes in places that there wouldn't otherwise be collective demand. If, on the other hand, we think of them as just replacements for cars and like, can you afford your Roadster? That would be a very different configuration for somebody on a limited income who is wondering if they'll be able not to have to buy one of these things, but just be in one for a little bit.
But I would also note just on privatization of transport. So I was just in Silicon Valley, and so all of the big companies, Apple is shipping thousands of people on these trucks, on these buses, and no one else can ride them. And there's this interesting issue downtown San Francisco where the land prices around these Apple bus stops is going up, but the people who are being sort of afflicted by the gentrification can't even get on these buses. And so, again, this is the markets versus law. I think that if you look at Silicon Valley, you see this, the privatization of a lot of basic infrastructure. So, again, ACLU and others who are in civil society, I mean, I think that left to its own devices, I think the market could end up in a very weird place where it's accessible just for the people who have the money.
And that's a way, I think, turning back to your global flows slide, of not just thinking about the role of government the way that, understandably, ministries like this one are thinking, which is really close to our liability questions. These cars are about to be on the roads. It's possible to give them instructions to do X if Y happens. Who should be responsible for those formulas? How much discretion should be left to the human quote-unquote driver, but really just conductor who will be giving instructions to the car? You could see giving them a range of instruction discretion. All of that is still up in the air as we see. It's just starting to be written. But there's also these much more global questions about what kind of infrastructure do we want to see built. And it doesn't require physical infrastructure, so it doesn't feel perhaps as much a societal question, even though there will no doubt be an infrastructure and a self-reinforcing one, depending on what kind of hardware, software, and relationships among it all ends up getting deployed. And in some ways, I heard you, Joey, saying that there might be something nice about building it incrementally, seeing how we react, adjusting as we go, rather than trying to specify everything up front. But militating against that is the idea that for some of the futures we might want to build, it really requires a transportation policy, a social policy, a welfare policy, an infrastructure policy up front to try to get from here to there, even though you're not physically building a road. And that seems to me equally, completely unanswered.
And I hypothesize that what's going to happen is you're going to see different versions in different countries. Japanese are going to be very different from the Chinese. The Europeans are going to be very different from the Americans. So how the companies respond is going to be very interesting. And I think that what we'll see is that, I mean, we see this like in the educational system experiments in Europe doing tremendously well. And whether we completely separate or whether we learn from the countries that are doing it well. And I think that it's actually a real opportunity to take some of these social systems and like look at socialist countries and see how they approach it compared to the, you know, sort of very commercial Silicon Valley side.
Yeah.
We're sort of running out of time, so
we are.
should wrap up.
So you can see, like, if you're thinking about like a possible end product for the class, like just there's so much here. Like take advantage of the fact that everybody is clueless and see about reflecting on what contribution you want to make that could move the car forward or backwards if you think that's the way it should go.
Yeah, and also as we go through the class, many of the people in this room have a lot of connections, but we are connected to many of the companies, many of the R&D labs of the auto companies, the government. So the extent to which you want to do research or dig in, especially if you really want to get into the role, we can probably connect you to the person who actually is that role. So, so feel free to pull on us for resources and connections, because a lot of this is really happening live, and I think it would be fascinating if you guys can bring in your own facts and ideas as we dig in.
Should we ask Natalie, Sam, and Jordy anything you want to be able to say? Okay, we should get the box over to you so there's equal accessibility to these announcements.
Thank you. Some of them are really stupid announcements, like before you leave, can you please give me your cards with your names back and also throw out all your garbage. Also, there's reading for next week on the table over there if you haven't taken one already. That one's Kathy O'Neill's reading. Kathy will be, I believe, joining us next week, so if you have questions for her from those readings, you should keep them in mind. Also, if anyone who hasn't sent me their short bio or image of themselves, please do so that we can learn who everybody is. No, I have yours already. And also, if you could fill out the spreadsheet with your role, the one that I sent in the Slack, so that we know who Apple is and who Tencent is and everybody else can know who you are, that would be great for next week.
Spirited session. We will see you next week.